Hey there, I'm Sarah A. Chrisman, the author of The Tales of Chetzemoka, and today I'm going to talk to you about how a loophole in married women's property laws in the late 19th century led to some really magnificent Victorian mansions.
In Delivery Delayed, Book 4 of the Tales of Chetzemoka, Addie makes a joke about the Married Woman's Property Act not pertaining to gossip. It's a case where I, as a writer, managed to slip in a casual reference to a piece of history which is little known today, but would have been very familiar to people at the time the story takes place. It's really quite an interesting detail of life in the late Victorian era, and I believe it deserves to be better remembered. In researching Victorian mansions, a common theme emerges. Many of them were built not for the rich men who commissioned them, but for their beloved wives. Such histories have always struck me as deeply romantic ones. Modern minds often view the term romantic as synonymous with frivolous, but for the Victorians nothing could have been further from the case. The wives of those gallant men doubtless adored their sumptuous homes, but the gifts had a very practical side as well. The home was considered woman's sphere, and it was natural that the property should be in her name. More importantly, though, in the late 19th century, when a man gave property to his wife, it became completely protected by law from any confiscation to cover the man's debts. The men who commissioned architectural masterpieces like the Anne Sterrett mansion and then gave them to their wives knew exactly what they were doing. A businessman does not become wealthy enough to have such a house built without substantial financial acumen. Of course, he and his wife would take advantage of any means at their disposal to protect their property. In earlier times, the marriage laws of most places held the property of married couples in common between the husband and wife. Legally, they were considered to be a single unit. This goes all the way back to the Old Testament ideas about marriage being a case of two becoming one. The property was historically recorded under the husband's name because it had to be under someone's name, and in any sort of functional marriage where husband and wife work as a team, the question of whose name was attached to documents seemed largely a pedantic one.
Now, in the early Victorian era, critics said that system was subject to abuse. After all, what about dysfunctional marriages where the husband and wife didn't work as a team? Now, in his novel Man and Wife, Wilkie Collins, who was essentially the John Grisham of the Victorian era, imagined a scene where something like this happened. Now, his writing, it was published in 1870, but the scene takes place much earlier. "I have bought the furniture with my own money, sir," I says. "It's mine, honestly come by, with bill and receipt to prove it. They are taking it away from me by force to sell against my will. Don't tell me that's the law. This is a Christian country. It can't be." "My good creature," says he, "you are a married woman. The law doesn't allow a married woman to call anything her own unless she has previously, with a lawyer's help, made a bargain to that effect with her husband before marrying him. You have made no bargain. Your husband has a right to sell your furniture if he likes." So, that was the criticism. That was what happened when things went wrong. And because of scenarios like that, there were changes made in the marriage and divorce laws in the Victorian era. And these changes separated the property of married women from their husbands. Now, they permitted a married woman to hold her own assets in her own name, and they protected the wife's property from the husband's debts. Now, it didn't take long for smart couples to realize that this could be used to their advantage. As long as the husband and wife trusted each other, all they had to do to make things safe from debts was to put as much as possible into the wife's name. Now, in 1872, in this nonfiction book by Gail Hamilton, she writes about the situation then. Quote, "It seemed an unjust and degrading thing for a married woman not to be allowed to hold property independent of her husband. and one state after another changed its laws to enable her to do so. But testimony goes to show that the principal practical use made of the law thus far has been to enable the husband to put his property into the hands of his wife, and thus live on the enjoyment of it and do business on the strength of it, without having it liable for his debts or subject to the risks of business. So again, they were just putting all the husband's as much of the husband's property as possible into the wife's name, and it was just inviolate, protected from any debtors. A good description of the property rights of married women at that point is in this book called The Woman's Book, which was very popular. It was a book for women in the Victorian era to help them understand various aspects of life and also their rights under the law. And it says, quote, "With reference to statutes or court decisions presenting or defining any of the distinctions between men and women in the management of affairs, those of the state of New York will be taken as a guide in whatever may be said here. The reason for this is not only the excellence of the New York Code, but the fact that so many of the states recently created have either adopted it as a whole or accepted it as a model. No perceptible change is effected by marriage in the property rights of a woman living under any of the codes modeled upon that of New York. Her control of all that was her own remains the same during her life, and any right passing to her husband at her death is limited by the questions of children or no children, as well as by any last will and testament which she may leave behind her." So they were very concerned with protecting the children's rights. In many of the laws, especially even the earlier laws, they were most concerned with the property that would go to the children. Above and beyond any concerns of the rights of the husband and wife, they were worried about the rights of their children. She, on the other hand, acquires no right in his personal property beyond her right to be supported, sometimes pretty widely interpreted with references to debts of her contracting. So it doesn't matter how many shopping sprees she goes on, he's still liable for any debts she incurs. In his real estate, she acquires a right of dower, the only visible effect of which, during his life, she will discover to be the necessity he is under of obtaining her signature, jointly with his own, to any deed or other instrument affecting the ownership of his landed estate. So if he wants to do anything with his property, he has to get her okay. She doesn't have to do that for her property, but he does for his. She cannot be compelled by him to sign any such paper. It must be done with her free will and consent, and she must say that it is so in a written affidavit, or the paper is defective and the title does not pass away so far as her rights are concerned. So, she had complete control over her property, and her property was protected from his debtors. His property could be confiscated for her debts, and if he wanted to do anything with his property, he had to get her permission in a legal binding document. And she had to sign an additional form saying he had not coerced this out of her. And in England, things were pretty similar. So this is the English version. You'll note it's pretty similar to what I just read about the American situation. With reference to all property accruing to any wife since 1882, it is hers, without the intervention of or legal participation of her husband, to do with as she thinks fit, her rights and liabilities with reference to such property being the same as if she were not married. So, it's a little more succinct, but it basically says the same thing. Now, this could sometimes go awry, and, human beings being what they are, it happens. Gail Hamilton describes how people could abuse this. But in this case, it's the husband getting abused. In New York, a married woman holds, independent of her husband's control, $30,000. This money she received from him when he was in good business and in full health. He became paralyzed, and she at once took a paramour and sailed to Europe, leaving her husband an annuity of $300 and supporting her paramour out of the proceeds of the fortune which her husband had given her. So, there is always a possibility for abusing any system. As Gail Hamilton puts it, no law exists which cannot be made the instrument of injustice. Under the best and wisest laws individuals may suffer. No law can be framed which shall completely shield man or woman from the consequences of ignorance, incapacity, or folly. You can place the control of property, the rights of contract, with husband or wife, or both, and it will still remain that if a woman marry a brutal, coarse, selfish, or lazy man, she will suffer for it, in mind, body, and estate. If a man marry a frivolous, unprincipled, uneducated woman, she will drag him down. No change in laws can affect the fact that in marriage the character of the parties is of the first importance, and the settlement of their property is but subordinate. If they are wise and good, they are more likely to be happy than if they are foolish and selfish. And that's really the moral of the story, is that if people are good to each other, things generally work out. A lot of modern commentators have really crazy ideas about the Victorian property laws and what they were about. They were complicated, and they changed over time, and there's a lot to them. And a lot of people today want to just take a really simplistic view of things and say, it was this way, and they have a sentence that's this short to explain what this way was. But truth is, laws are always really complicated, and in some cases they did favor women. So the next time somebody tries to give you an explanation of the way things were at any given time, and that explanation is about half a sentence long, get yourself some books from that time and go ahead and read through them and find out for yourself what things were actually like, because a lot of the time you'll be surprised and usually quite pleased. Thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a nice thumbs up, and remember to tell your friends about my books. Happy reading!